Why does one want to manage their bucks? Well, technically we all manage deer every time we pull the trigger, but we're talking specifically selecting deer to shoot. Who should do this? Before we even get into this, the first thing that we need to cover emphatically is that you cannot alter genetics on wild whitetails by shooting a deer. There has been study after study after study after study done on this. Between yearling buck dispersal, so much of the antler genetics coming from the doe, it just can't be done. So if you can't, why would you? Well, we can manage the standing stock of deer. This does not apply to most people out there, quite honestly, and that's really why I'm doing this show, is simply to try to share my belief that managing bucks doesn't apply to most people out there. Okay, I'm not talking about if you want to wait until they get to be 3.5, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You want to shoot them at 2.5, that's fine. You want to shoot them at 1.5, as long as it's a legal buck, more power to you. What I'm specifically referring to is trying to increase the genetic capability on that ground. You can't do it. But what you can do is you can manage that standing stock. And there's a couple situations where that makes sense. For one thing, any buck you ever shoot, what you're doing is you're removing them off the feed. Okay? In overpopulated areas, that's management. That needs to be done. Although you're always much better off shooting a doe in those situations. Next, we simply cannot stockpile bucks on a piece of ground. I'm going to repeat that. We simply cannot pretend that our ground is nothing more than a warehouse that we can go ahead and store buck after buck in as long as we... That's not reality, people. It just isn't. What ends up happening is every ground has a cap. We can hold X number of deer on this ground. Now, with habitat improvement, if we really use our heads, we can go ahead and lay it out. Rather than have one big food source, one big bedding area, we can have multiple food sources and multiple bedding areas, allowing our herd to split up more. What is hardly never talked about in all of this stuff is simply social stress. Social stress on whitetails can be absolutely brutally deadly. It certainly impacts inches of antler, reproductive success, all that stuff. But we hardly ever talk about it. Well, the whitetail world will not allow their social stress to get above a certain level. The more deer they are, the more concentrated, the more fighting occurs. Therefore, what ends up happening is, I know this is actually applies to gases, but osmosis. Deer are leaving from areas of higher concentration, going to lower concentration. And what often ends up happening is we lose the very best bucks that are just below the dominant bucks. Why? Over here, I get my butt kicked. I go over to the neighbors where they shoot everything, and man, I got it made. So if I can only hold X amount of deer each year on that property, well, if I want to keep my best up and coming bucks, if I've got a 120-inch 3.5-year-old and a 160-inch 3.5-year-old, guess which one of the two I'm shooting if I want to have bigger bucks next year. This does not apply to the overwhelming majority of people out there. The overwhelming majority of you sincerely go out and hunt whatever legal buck makes you happy. And as far as what everybody else thinks, that's their problem. Okay, but for those that want to manage deer, that's what you can accomplish when it comes to your buck population. You can help manage the standing stock so you keep the best up-and-comers and take out the lower class, but don't even think about doing that until they hit 3.5 years old, because until then, way too much of it is based on when they were born. If they were born early, they got a great rack as a 2.5-year-old. If they were born late, they got a horrible rack as a 2.5-year-old. By 3.5, that tends to catch up. And now you're actually seeing the antler's potential.
Final thoughts, brought to you by Huntworth.
managing managing bucks specifically is talked about so ridiculously much these days, but I'm telling you, it doesn't apply to the overwhelming majority. And if you go ahead and pass up this deer with the idea that it will be there next year, that's the whole reason you're passing it up. Not because you don't want to shoot it, not because there's something else you want to shoot, but you really want to shoot this deer. But man, if I pass it up, you're get set for more frustration than reward, because a lot of deer die for a whole bunch of reasons that have nothing to do with hunting, and a buck's natural mortality rate is so ridiculously much higher than does. All that said, you can manage the standing stock. You can reduce the social stress that occurs on your ground, and you can up the odds a little bit for the best ones staying. How? By removing the lower class animals in the same age groups.